So, horror of horrors, well, not horror of horrors, but, well, actually, no, we'll scratch that, restart again. So, first things first, Carl has actually been deselected from UKIP. Hooray! So, turns out there is some sense in the, in the UKIP somewhere. But now, we go on to this other basic, shocking revelation that, literally I found. Well, it was shared on on Facebook, and I read this, and I'm like, oh my god, how is this possible? So somehow the Radio Times has produced the biggest piece of political dynamite that is buried in between this month's entire, shall we say, TV selection opportunities. So, well, here it is. Radio Times. The BBC policy on Brexit is not impartial. Why is the BBC giving so much time to hardline Brexiteers? Asks journalist Raymond Snoddy. That is his name. So, the BBC is always under attack from both the right and the left. Some hate its compulsory licence fee, and they claim they only watch Netflix, while the BBC could never satisfy the Daily Mail. But in the referendum campaign and the continuing painful confusion over the process of leaving the EU, however people voted, something odd has happened. Friends of the BBC have become critics. During the referendum campaign, the BBC was criticised for its tit-for-tat news coverage, which created what the former BBC journalist Professor Ivor Gibbons called a phony balance. He cites an example when the 128 business leaders signed a letter to the Times backing the UK membership in the EU. This story was balanced by a quote from a single entrepreneur, Sir James Dyson, and a warning from 10 Nobel Prize economists about the dangers of Brexit was balanced by one economist, Patrick Munford, a BBC regular. The BBC shrugged off all criticism, as it usually does. The corporation finds it very difficult to say sorry. That was then, but as the current political crisis deepens, there is little sign of change, if anything, and things have gotten worse. Former Labour Cabinet Minister Lord Adonis asked why Nigel Farage has appeared on BBC One's Question Time 32 times in recent years and is still appearing despite never having been elected to Parliament. He might have also asked why hardline Brexiteers such as Sir Bernard Jenkin and Jacob Rees-Mogg are seldom off the airwaves without having held government office. The heart of the problem is the BBC's interpretation of its own guidelines on impartiality when it comes to reporting Brexit. Director General Lloyd Hall says that the BBC is no longer reporting on a binary choice that faced the electorate in the referendum. By examining the Brexit negotiations and the impact of Brexit on the UK and the wider world, as the decision to leave the EU has been irrevocably taken. In Lord Adonis's view, Lord Hall has engaged in dereliction of his public duty because the editorial guidelines accept that the government view that the referendum vote is irreversible. As the Labour peer conveniently argues, that is not the case, either in law or in public debate. Given Parliament has yet to take the formal decision to leave the EU following the end of negotiations, Lord Adonis is making a strong point when, in his formal complaint, he accuses the BBC of breaching its royal charter, which governs everything the BBC does, and says BBC News must show due impartiality. Already, he says, it has meant that the BBC gives scant coverage to anti-Brexit marches. Former Guardian editor Alan Rustiberger, I think that's how you say it, Rusbridger, sees parallels with the BBC coverage of the Suez Crisis in 1915, when it was found afterwards that even Panorama had skirted around the fundamental issues. He argues in the New Statesman magazine recently that those who still believe... what? Hold on. I don't care. Sorry, it just popped up a ridiculous advert. I'm just like, why have you done that? Okay, so where we go. So he's argued in the New Statesman recently that those who still believe that Brexit would be an economic and foreign policy disaster for the UK are being portrayed by the BBC as undemocratic extremists. They are, says Rusbringer, says allowed a voice only if repeatedly challenged and balanced by a fervent Brexit hardliners. I believe it is in everyone's interest that if the UK is going to leave the EU, it should be in the light of the best, most comprehensive and accurate information possible. It is late, but not too late, for Lord Hall to withdraw his guidelines and admit that it was an honest mistake. If he does not, history will judge both him and the BBC coverage harshly when it is too late to do anything about it. And he's completely right. And remember, this is from the Radio Times. This hasn't come from a like the New Statesman or the Guardian. It has come from the Radio Times. And it is completely 100% right. The problem is that the BBC is unfairly representing the Brexit argument as if, you know, you must have these hardline Brexiteers to balance out someone who is basically laying out an accurate point. And when you have the situation of 100 business leaders in the UK saying that we must stay in the EU, and your idea for balance is to then go, well, here's James Dyson who says, no, it'll be fantastic to remain in the UK, and then moves everything to Singapore. You know, this is where one of the things that we are being let down in by the UK is that we have a lot of very good journalists out there, but the problem is it's not the journalists that are letting down and doing this. It tends to be the organisations themselves that are letting down the side, and giving accurate and good information is incredibly vital, because as we've said since the beginning, this whole mess, mainly a lot of people voted because they had no idea about the EU and voted under absolutely misinformed circumstances. When we leave the EU, it is going to be an absolute clusterfuck. And as I've said since the beginning, past 2 years, enjoy this, you know, this time while things still as they are, because as soon as we leave the EU, it's going to be an absolute clusterfuck. And the people who are to blame are these Brexiteers who lied and, you know, said that things would be fine, who live in this absolute fantasy land that somehow the UK is going to be released from its chains and somehow become this huge trading empire again. And I do not, mince my words when I say empire again, because many of them, that is exactly what they are championing. They are championing British Empire trading policies that we cannot enforce anymore because we do not have colonies. Well, we sort of do, but we do not have the, all these colonies that we used to have where you could just say, yeah, we're setting your trade policy. We can't do that anymore. But there are some people who seem to think we can, and that is not the case. World trade is incredibly complex. And as soon as we start putting up barriers, as soon as we start making trade difficult, it becomes worse for us, not the European Union or anyone else. And as has been reported recently, Donald Trump has expressed and told his trade diplomats that he wants more US interests to be involved in the NHS, which basically means more expensive drugs and basically piling more pressure on the NHS. So those people who are thinking of voting for the Brexit Party, remember this. If you like the NHS, remember that Nigel Farage wants to get rid of the NHS. He has said this multiple times, And there is a choice between what you want. You can either have Brexit, but if you want Brexit, you lose the NHS. It's gone. And I mean that in the sincerest terms, because I think one of the biggest fights after Brexit will be to keep the NHS as a free option of health, open to everyone and free at the point of usage. And that no one should be charged a penny or less in taxes and national insurance, but the Tories have been shown that they do not want to do that. So you have to ask yourself a serious question. Do you want Brexit so badly that you destroy the NHS, an institution that provides free healthcare to everyone in this country? Or do you want this faux sovereignty that we've already had, and we end up with worse trading conditions, worse off economically, and now you no longer have a free healthcare? Are you so desperate for Brexit that that's what you want? So, to anyone who thinks about voting for the Brexit Party, consider what I've just said there. Because if that happens, and you are upset that you lost the NHS, remember that you started this by voting to leave and giving a vote to Nigel Farage and his Brexit Party.